Hello everyone, my name is Preston Dennett, and thank you for joining me for a new episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. I have a pretty exciting episode for you today, I think. I am going to be talking about one of my favorite aspects of UFO research, which is of course face-to-face encounters with humanoids. The title of today's episode is The Most Terrifying Thing I've Ever Seen. 10 Scary Extraterrestrial Encounters. Fear does seem to be a common theme when people have a face-to-face encounter with an extraterrestrial, and that's certainly understandable. And we do see that in pretty much all of these cases today. I have 10 cases for you coming from all over the world, 7 outside of the United States, and 3 from within the United States. And these areas include Argentina, Brazil, Puerto Rico, Russia, South Africa, Uruguay, and in the United States, New York, South Carolina, and South Dakota. In Texas. These involve a wide variety of humanoids. We see grays, of course, human-looking ETs. Those are the most common types, but definitely some other unique humanoids. So lots of information to get through. Let's get started with our very first case, which I call I Was Scared to Death. This one occurred on March 4, 1967 in Eden, New York. And this involves a gentleman who had a pretty frightening face-to-face encounter with a humanoid. He was out hunting. I think you'll find this one pretty interesting. This first case was published in the Buffalo News newspaper and also appeared in John Keel's book, Our Haunted Planet. The witness was DeWitt Baldwin. At the time of his encounter, he was a 46-year-old employee of the Mater Plastering Corporation. It was 1:30 a.m. on March 1st, 1967. This was a cold night with snow on the ground, and DeWitt was out raccoon hunting with his shotgun and dog in the woods outside the small town of Eden, New York. And I'll just let DeWitt describe what happened in his own words. As he says, "I was alone. My dog was with me, but was in a nearby woods. I heard this funny noise. It wasn't too loud. I flashed my flashlight on it, and it was a flying saucer and had landed nearby. I was scared. I didn't know what to do. While I was watching it, a door opened, like a sliding elevator door, and a man walked out and down the incline of the machine. He was dressed in a sort of black, tight-fitting suit, like a flyer, and had on some sort of helmet and goggles. He wasn't white, and he wasn't a Negro. He talked very plainly and with no accent. He had black, curly hair. Now, per the witness, this saucer was, quote, kind of gold in color. He said it had no lights or illumination, no windows that he could see. But at this point, DeWitt and the ET held a short conversation. As DeWitt says, he asked me what I was doing, and I told him I was hunting. He asked me if I was born here, and I said no, that I was born in Georgia. He took my gun, looked at it, and handed it back to me. He told me he would be back, walked up to the saucer, got in, and a second later zipped out of sight. Now after the craft was gone, DeWitt checked the ground, and he saw that the snow beneath it was undisturbed, and as DeWitt says, there were no footprints of the man either after he left. So DeWitt went home and told his wife, and she later confirmed this to researchers and said, I don't know what he saw, but he certainly was excited when he got home. It was then that DeWitt noticed that his rifle was broken with a crack in the muzzle, and he does blame the ET for the damage to his gun. DeWitt was put in touch with UFO researcher James Siprel of the National Investigative Committee on Aerial Phenomena, NICAP, who didn't discount the sighting outright, but did say that they were unable to verify it either. As James Siprel says, quote, after careful investigation into the alleged report, we find no evidence to substantiate the fact that a UFO landed or an occupant was seen, or any of the events associated with the report took place. John Keel was not impressed by NICAP's conclusion, and he writes, and I quote, in case after case, amateur investigators have rejected the testimony of sincere witnesses who claim to have seen UFOs land and entities dismount because no footprints could be found on the ground afterwards. And I have to agree with that. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, as has been said before. Needless to say, DeWitt was of course convinced. As he says, quote, "I was scared to death, but I'm going back out there with some fellows." I like that case. Yes, it is a single witness case, but we do know who the witness is. It's also interesting because this case was thoroughly investigated by a professional researcher. To me, one of the interesting things about this case is the fact that the man handed over his gun to the ET and the ET handed it back broken. I found that kind of interesting. And I do know of a few other cases where this same exact thing happened. So I don't know. Maybe there's a pattern there. But certainly an unusual case. Now let's move to the next one, which again is not very well known. I call this one an intelligent and fearless man. This occurred on November 26, 1967, actually over a period of a couple of days in Americana, Brazil. I like this case because the witness is a police officer and he had a very close interaction with what appear to be human-like ETs, or perhaps these were humans in a reverse-engineered craft. You can make up your own mind about it, but it's definitely an unusual close encounter. This next case was pretty thoroughly researched. It comes from Professor Flavio Pereira and the Brazilian Commission for the Confidential Investigation of Unidentified Flying Objects, and it appeared in the September-October 1968 issue of the APRO Bulletin. The actual investigators are Dr. Methodios Kalkaslev and Dr. Max Berezovsky. The witness is an anonymous patrolman, and this case took place just outside of the city of Americana, Brazil. It was on the night of November 26, 1967. The police officer was at the 124-kilometer mark of the Anhanguera Highway outside of Americana when he saw what appeared to be an aircraft in distress. It had no lights on and it was descending from the sky. So he stopped his car, leapt out and ran across the street towards the area, quote, in order to go to the assistance of those who might have been injured in the disaster. But arriving at the spot, he saw now that this object had actually stopped 150 feet above the ground and was hovering in place. And it wasn't a plane. It was something he had never seen before. This was a very large craft, as he says, quote, as high as a 15-story building, and elongated. He said it was silvery aluminum in color and was spinning in place. He could see hatchways on the lower section and what looked to him to be enormous rivets. The officer decided to return to his patrol post, but as he did so, the object emitted brilliant lights which were similar, he said, to electric welding torches, but, quote, millions of times brighter. In fact, they were so bright he was unable to look directly at them. At the same time, he heard a very loud humming noise, so loud in fact that it hurt his ears and caused him to clamp his hands over his ears. So he fled to his patrol car, but when he tried to turn on the ignition, the engine wouldn't start. At the same time, he saw that the lights in the police cabin and the nearby gas station were also out. A truck passed by at this time, and it also came to a stop as apparently its engine also failed. After a few seconds, the strange object took off, and the lights in the police cabin and gas station came back on, and the officer was now able to start his patrol car. He drove directly to the police station and reported the sighting to the man on duty, and the two of them drove back to where he had seen the object, and they now saw that the object was just a very bright light high in the sky. Now later, the officer learned that the two fluorescent lights in the mechanic's workshop about 300 feet away from the site were burned out, and so was the TV screen in the mechanic's home. So some interesting electromagnetic effects there. The patrolman was so impressed by his encounter that over the next few days he kept a closer watch on the sky than he did on the passing cars. And his patience was rewarded 2 days later. It was 2:30 a.m. on November 28 when the officer saw what appeared to be the same craft approaching from the same direction it had been earlier. This time the officer was ready, and he grabbed his revolver, ran across the road, and hid himself in a gully covered with bushes, hoping to observe this craft without being seen. The object now hovered about 100 feet overhead and 150 feet away from the officer. He became very nervous at this point and couldn't decide whether or not to fire his revolver at the craft. This is when a kind of elevator with 3 sides, open in front, came down from beneath the object, and inside this elevator-type device, the patrolman could see 2 human-looking figures wearing skin-tight frogman outfits with wide belts. The belts were each lit up with brilliant points of light. Now the figure on the right apparently saw the patrolman as he began to speak to him, telling him to put his gun away, not to be afraid, that he was an intelligent and fearless man, and that they would be coming back for him. Despite these assurances, this last statement made the patrolman want to leave his hiding place, but he found that he couldn't move because his legs felt very weak and, quote, would not obey. At this point, the elevator with the 2 men in it retracted back into the craft, which took off and disappeared. The patrolman now returned to his station and reported the event to his superior. Coral and Jim Lorenzen were impressed by these 2 sightings, and they say that these sightings, quote, bolster our contention that South America will ultimately contribute much in the way of factual information about the UFOs, for that continent seems to be the recipient of far more close-up sightings and landings than any other comparable landmass in the world, or at least people are reporting sightings far more often than elsewhere. An amazing case, especially because it involved some considerably extensive electromagnetic effects and more than one sighting, more than one witness. So that alone, I think, makes it a very important case. I do wonder who these humanoids were that the police officer saw, whether they were human-looking ETs or perhaps people from this planet flying a reverse-engineered craft. Very hard to say for sure, but I think it's important to consider this possibility. All right, let's move to the next case, which I call Leave Now. This one occurred on April 4, 1969, outside of the small town of Dillon in South Carolina. This is a multiple witness case. The witnesses are both military men, and it's quite an unusual case, as we shall see. This very unusual case was reported to MUFON, the Mutual UFO Network, some 36 years after it occurred. Again, it involves 2 witnesses, both young soldiers from Fort Bragg, North Carolina. The main witness is anonymous, so I'll call him Kyle. The other witness is his friend Charlie. That is apparently his real name. The encounter occurred on April 4, 1969. The 2 men were on leave from Fort Bragg and had decided that to relieve their boredom, they would set out on a hitchhiking expedition down to Myrtle Beach in South Carolina, hoping to join the spring break partying at the popular seaside town. At around sunset, they headed outside of Fayetteville along Interstate 95, carrying nothing but their backpacks and sleeping bags. They eventually reached a coffee shop just south of the North Carolina border outside the town of Dillon, and here they had a bit of a run-in with, quote, a group of local rowdies, who were apparently looking for trouble and kept casting dirty looks in their direction. As they were hitchhiking soldiers, they didn't want to get into any trouble, so they finished up their meal and began to walk down the highway towards the city of Latta, and apparently these rowdy fellows from the coffee shop also followed them and began to drive back and forth, hooting and hollering at them. Now, realizing this could lead to real trouble, the 2 soldiers waited until the men were out of sight, and they quickly slipped off the road and instead headed south along a dirt road behind a vacant, deserted gas station. They had evaded the rowdies, but were now in almost complete darkness in a remote area outside of town, and this is when something very strange happened. And I'll just quote the main witness, Kyle, directly. As he says, as the 2 of us picked our way carefully down the car path, the whole area suddenly lit up in an aqua-green glow, showing a small field no more than a few acres in size. Now I could see clearly, and what I saw amazed me. there was a 3 or 4 story high, multi-decked UFO standing on what seemed to be metal legs. In addition, there were beings similar to humans, a head with 2 eyes, 2 arms, an upright and 2 legs, but colored green, either an effect of the ambient light or the result of my extreme confusion and fear. They were walking in the field and on the decks which curved around the ship, with the nearest one about 20 feet away. He, she, or it turned our way and said firmly, and I believe telepathically, "Leave now." Now neither Kyle nor Charlie hesitated, but immediately left. As Kyle says, in spite of the danger that had caused us to leave the highway in the first place, both Charlie and myself, like the trained soldiers we were, executed a smart about-face and marched right back towards trouble. We hiked at a pretty quick route step down the road a few miles without saying a word or looking at each other, hoofing it just as fast as we could out of Dillon into some farming and pasturage area. Presently, the rowdies showed up once more in their car, making it clear we were their targets for this night. Once again, as their cars went out of sight, we left the highway into a cow pasture this time. From a spot a few hundred yards off the road, we watched them as they returned looking for us. Eventually the night settled down and the cars were gone. We climbed into our sleeping bags. The next morning we continued on to Myrtle Beach. Now that seemed to be the end of it, but it's not the end of the story. As Kyle says, here's the best part. As far as I can recall, we had both forgotten about the UFO. One day, 30 years later, my buddy called up from out of the blue and asked me, "Do you remember Dillon?" I had no idea what he was talking about, but as soon as he said, "The UFO," the whole experience came back in a flash. We saw a spacecraft and humanoids on the ground. While that case has not been officially investigated, it certainly is a compelling case. Multiple witnesses, military officers are pretty good observers. They had a very close encounter. I wonder about this one because it seems to be synchronistic. Perhaps it was just pure chance that they left the road and came upon this craft. I don't know, but given that they had telepathic communication, this does sound like genuine extraterrestrials. Another really interesting aspect to this case is a detail we see quite often where both the witnesses forget about the encounter, do not discuss it at all. So there's this weird amnesia aspect to a number of UFO encounters. Not exactly sure what's going on, other than this is something that's very hard for people to process. I don't know, but I'm glad that they did remember. It does make me wonder if perhaps there was a more extensive encounter that they do not recall, but very hard to say for sure. Now let's move to the next case. This one is super interesting. I call this one the most terrifying thing I've ever seen. This one occurred over a period of days in mid-August of 1972 in South Africa, for a pretty wide area, but mostly in Natal, South Africa. A lot of witnesses to this one. This one occurred during a UFO wave, although the humanoid sightings that I will be recounting don't seem to have a direct UFO connection. I think we can be pretty certain that this strange humanoid that these people saw was certainly not from here. A very unusual humanoid, as we shall see. This series of humanoid visitations took place at the tail end of a UFO wave located mostly in Natal, South Africa, and it was published in the November-December 1972 issue of Flying Saucer Review and in the January-February 1973 issue of the APRO Bulletin. The first sighting took place on August 16, 1972, to store clerk Elias Kosa. He was walking to his home in Roosboom when he noticed a strange glowing figure. Now he couldn't see it very well, so he called out to the figure to come visit and share a drink with him, and he was surprised because at this point this figure actually shot upwards at high speed, seemingly emitting flames and smoke. So clearly not a normal person. And it was shortly after this, 2 days later, August 18, 1972, at 7:30 p.m., there was another humanoid encounter that was very similar. 18-year-old Ingrid Hansen was outside her home on Malver Road in Mayville. This is in Durban, South Africa. She came rushing into the house screaming and crying that she'd seen a ghost. So her mother Thelma rushed outside and saw this very tall figure. It appeared to have a huge box-like head with a single flashing light in the center. It was flashing white, then blue, then red. She said it had its arms in front of it and was swaying weirdly from side to side, seemingly watching her. As Ingrid said, it was staring at us by the fence. It was horrible. It was not a real person. She said, quote, "There was a fire coming out of its eyes, and the head was square, like a machine." She also said that the figure seemed to draw her towards it, as if it had, quote, "some sort of hypnotic effect." Thelma called it, quote, "the most terrifying thing I've ever seen in my life." Events weren't over yet, because the very next night at 11 p.m., August 19, Thelma Hansen was walking home from visiting a neighbor when she and several of her neighbors saw what appeared to be the same figure now standing at the bottom of Thelma's yard. About 10 people saw this. This figure disappeared, and afterwards they checked the area where they had seen this figure but could find no evidence of it. As Thelma says, "If it's a joke, who's doing it and why? It's frightening us all to death." Now here's something interesting. Following this encounter, several of the witnesses reported strange after effects, such as headaches and pain in their legs. Meanwhile, the sightings continued. It was just 2 days later, on August 21st, 1972, at 4:30 a.m., that Doris Muthwa and her 12-year-old daughter Joyce went to get some water from the river near their home in Roosboom, and this is when they saw what appears to be this same strange tall figure. As Doris says, "I looked up, and there seemed to be a man in a white suit. I thought he was smoking a cigarette, but then the smoke became like a big fire. There was a bright light shining from his chest." They said this figure appeared to be over 11 feet tall, as compared to a nearby tree. Suddenly this man shot up into the sky and disappeared. Both mother and daughter were so badly frightened by this strange sight that Doris screamed out loud and her daughter Joyce began crying. They both fell over, dropped the water, and fled in fear. Later, a friend of Doris, Mrs. Harding, said, quote, "Doris is a bright, intelligent woman. I know she is telling the truth." Really not sure what to make of that humanoid case. It seems to be genuine given that there are so many witnesses who saw it so close up. They had physiological effects, so there's really no way to deny this as, say, a hoax or a delusion or anything like that. Clearly something happened here. Robotic ETs, perhaps? I don't know. It's so unusual. I can't say I've heard of a description quite like the one that these witnesses give. That's why I like some of these cases, because they're very hard to categorize, and each one of these cases offers us new knowledge about the extraterrestrial presence on our planet. So now let's move to the next case, which is a single witness case. I don't believe it's been formally investigated, but it's certainly a compelling case. I call this one Not One of Ours. This one occurred on September 25, 1973 in Waco, Texas, and I think you'll find it pretty interesting. The witness in this case is anonymous, so I'll just call him Christopher. At the time of his encounter, he was enrolled in a doctoral course at Baylor University. He was driving home from class around 8:30 p.m. on September 25, 1973, and he was headed west when he noticed a bright light above Lake Waco. At first he assumed it was Venus, but then he realized that the light was moving towards his right, so he revised his theory and assumed that this must be a helicopter. So he was driving over the bridge at Lake Waco. He took the right exit towards Spiegelville Park and could now see that the craft was in a stationary position, hovering over the west side of the lake. And as he got closer to the craft, he saw that it turned off its light and started moving to the southwest, and he could now see that it was quite unusual. As Christopher says, "I could tell it was a black triangular craft. It crossed over the highway, and I decided to follow it. I got back on the highway and watched the craft cross over the highway and settle behind a clump of trees on the south side of the highway. So curious, Christopher drove closer to where he had seen the craft disappear behind the trees. He got about 300 feet away from the area and turned off his car lights and kept watching, and soon he saw it again. As Christopher says, I saw it slowly rise from the trees and start coming towards where I was parked. It then pulled up to where I was on the other side of the fence. It turned facing me and stayed motionless, making no sound. I could definitely tell that the craft was black, triangular in shape, about 20 feet wide and 30 feet long. It had a cockpit with a greenish hue inside, and I could see the shadows of 3 small heads peering down at me. After about 4 or 5 minutes, a green light shined down on my vehicle, causing the engine to die. I tried to restart it to no avail. I tried turning on my light and then the radio, but nothing worked. Getting nervous, I locked my doors. So Christopher watched the object for the next 15 to 20 minutes. He really had no choice. Every 2 or 3 minutes, he tried over and over again to start his car, but it would not turn on. When he finally got the engine started, he drove 300 feet down the road, turned on his lights, and turned around. As Christopher says, as I drove past the craft on my left, it hadn't moved. When I got back on the highway heading east, I could see it was still there. Having served 2 years in the Air Force ROTC and 2 years in the U.S. Army with a top secret clearance, I can say without any doubt that this craft was not one of ours. Now 3 years later, he says he saw an identical craft above the south end of the La Vega football field, apparently observing the football game. He wanted to drive closer, but his wife was with him and she did not want to go. I like that case because given the witness's background, he's clearly a very credible and qualified witness. I do wonder about what he saw. I understand that the triangular craft are often our own reverse-engineered craft. Then again, this witness insists that this was not one of ours, and he's in a position to know. He did see humanoids, though he wasn't able to describe them clearly or didn't see them that clearly. So I don't know. Either way, it shows how complex this subject can be. Now let's move to the next encounter, which is probably my favorite in this compilation. It's very alarming and so unusual, and there are very few cases like this one, as we shall see. I call this next segment, I Was So Scared. This one occurred in November of 1979. It's a daylight encounter in the area of Tallaboa, Puerto Rico. This is so incredible. This alarming and very unusual case comes from researcher Jorge Martin and was published in Evidencia OVNI issue 1 and also in the winter 1997 issue of Flying Saucer Review in an article titled, I Saw a Man Being Kidnapped by Extraterrestrials. This case took place along the coast of southwest Puerto Rico near the town of Tallaboa. One morning around 9 a.m. in November of 1979, Hector Maldonado, age 39, was jogging along the coast near the mouth of the Tallaboa River by some mangrove thickets when he saw something very unusual. And I'll just quote Hector directly. As he says, I chanced to turn around suddenly, and there were 5 or 6 strange beings there, between 5 and 6 feet tall, thin, with bald, biggish heads, big almond-shaped glowing eyes, just as though lit up with bright lights, not in the slightest bit normal. It was broad daylight, so it was not a case of some sort of light reflected in their eyes in the way it is at night with animal eyes. The light came from inside their eyes. They had thin necks and long arms and long hands and fingers. I didn't note how many fingers. I was too shaken to notice it. The strangest thing was that their skin was a grayish-blue color. I couldn't see any clothing on them, unless that grayish-blue stuff was itself something that covered their entire body. But to me, they looked naked. I spotted no sign of any genitals at any time, though to be honest, I didn't fix my attention specially on that. So what really caught Hector's attention, even more than what the aliens looked like, was what they were doing. As Hector says, The astonishing thing was that they had got hold of a man and were taking him off. He was a human, olive-skinned, about 5 feet 9 inches in height, with lank black hair, and apparently unconscious. He looked as if he was petrified, with his eyes closed, and they had got hold of him by the armpits. They appeared to be very strong, because 2 of them were lifting him off the ground with ease. He wasn't even dragging his feet. I didn't get a clear view of his face, because I could only see him from the side. So Hector's attention now shifted to where the ETs were taking this man. As Hector says, behind the beings, above the sea, a bit beyond the mangroves, there was a machine hanging stationary in the air. It looked more or less oval in shape, with a cupola on top, and its sides sort of fluted or grooved. And on top of it, it had a narrow curved projection with lots of lights, just like a garland of lights that you see at Christmas time. The thing was of a silvery metallic color, and big, really big, and just hanging in the air, not making a sound. Now during all this observation, Hector was still jogging along the beach, and at this point he himself became a participant in the encounter. As Hector says, suddenly one of them, who had been kneeling and seemed to be looking at something on the ground, got up and signed to me, and then I felt something, as if it were in my mind, like a voice, but a bit strange, different from that, coming seemingly from that being. And I heard him say jestingly to the other, "Look at that one, how he's running." And then the being himself started running and making fun of me. Then I got the impression that he said, "Now, just look how I run." And he started moving at quite a fantastic speed. When he was mocking me, he had got great big teeth, pointed ones, like a shark's teeth. This alien then stopped by the others and told them telepathically, and overheard by Hector too, "We'll just take him too." The others replied, "Not him, leave him alone." Hector was now only a few feet from the aliens. As Hector says, next, that one that had laughed at me and wanted to take me, gestured towards me with his hand and threw something like a great big drop of some sort of cold liquid, which hit me in the chest. Where that had hit me, I at once began to feel very queer, as though my body was swelling up, and I was feeling stiff, like a sort of cramp. But I was so scared that I forced myself to keep on running. Now as he ran, Hector said this strange feeling became less and less. He looked back and saw that the beings were still dragging this man towards the location of their craft, but he was too scared to stop. When he looked back a second time, the craft was gone. Hector left the area as fast as he could, and fearing ridicule, he at first told nobody. As Hector says, "I was so scared, and felt sure that nobody would believe me. Who was going to believe a story like that? They'd say I was mad, and I wasn't going to expose myself to that. My fear was too great, and I did nothing. For a long time, I carried in my mind the scene of what happened. I couldn't stop thinking about it, but bit by bit, I got control of myself and was able to bear it." Now for some time he stopped jogging in that area. It took him about 3 years before he went back. It was around 1982 or 83 that he returned, and he had another strange experience. He was amazed when he came upon a perfect circle depressed into the ground about 100 feet wide. And that's not all he saw. As Hector says, it looked just as though something large and heavy had rested there, and I was astonished to see this, but I also noticed that over on the further edge of the circle, some individuals with a red minibus belonging to the Civil Defense Department were checking the circle. So after this, Hector was prompted to start reading about UFOs, and this encouraged him to reach out to UFO researchers, which led to this case being investigated and published by Jorge Martin. How about that? Really unusual. I did a whole episode on cases involving observed abductions, which I called Caught in the Act. Check that out. There are other cases like this, but again, they are exceedingly unusual. So I'm not sure what to make of this case, but you have to ask yourself, if this happened to you, would you tell anyone? I certainly understand the witness keeping this secret. Also interesting to me is that he described the Greys as having very sharp teeth. This is a detail that turns up in a number of cases, which I think adds a little extra credibility to this particular account. But how unusual! I can only imagine how disconcerting it must have been to have this kind of encounter. All right, let's move to the next one. Of all the encounters in this compilation, this one probably got the most publicity, and you may have heard of it. I call this one, I Don't Know What Happened. This occurred on April 22nd, 1980 in Santa Rosa, Argentina. It is a single witness case, though there are some outside corroborating witnesses, and this one involves some really unusual humanoids. This case was first published in the Chronica newspaper and was later investigated by a team of researchers, among them Pedro Romaniuk, Fabio Picasso, and many others. The case later appeared in several UFO publications. It was around 7:15 p.m., around dusk, on April 22, 1980, that the witness, Fermin Nelson Sayago, the head of a construction painting company, was driving northbound on Santiago Marco Avenue, just east of Santa Rosa. It was raining, and Fermin was crossing over the railroad tracks when, as he says, quote, something dark and oval-shaped came at me from above. He estimates it was about the size of a room, maybe 10 by 10 feet, not big, and as Fermin says, the place was very dark, and there was much fog that night. Suddenly a black shape appeared and placed itself above my car to the point when I only thought of throwing myself on the wheel. The car's engine stopped, and the lights went out simultaneously, and I instinctively covered my face with my hands on the steering wheel. He thought the object was actually going to crash into his car, but instead his car stopped alongside the road. So he got out. As Fermin says, I got out, and when I was about to open the hood, I began to feel an intense cold from the legs up to the waist and felt paralyzed. I had a sensation of vacuum. He says he also heard a sound similar to the jingling of keys, and this is when he noticed a strange humanoid standing next to his car. As Fermin says, it was gesturing to me with its hands, as if to tell me to stay calm. And then he saw a second figure, and no, he was not calm. As Fermin says, two luminous black figures placed themselves, one on each side of me. They had no face. They were similar to skulls without eyes on their faces. They moved in a strange manner, and seemed to gesture, as if they wanted to talk to me. Suddenly, I don't know what movement I may have made, one of them covered my head with his hands. They were much bigger than ours. Their fingers were long and cold. When he took hold of me, I felt something like a lashing on my head and the sensation that he had extracted blood, together with a feeling of weakness. From that moment until I found myself where a friend helped me, I don't know what happened. Fermin later described the beings in more detail, saying that they had a dark face, a flat nose, a large mouth, and large ears that stuck out from the side of their heads. They were wearing a dark gray, shiny metallic scaled uniform with what appeared to be a kind of medallion hanging from a chain around their necks. They were 6 to 7 feet tall, and Fermin was turning to run. This is when he saw the second identical-looking being standing behind him, and this is when this second being grabbed him by the head and seemingly lifted him gently up into the air. And as Fermin says, at that moment, I felt a prick in my head and fainted. The next thing he knew, he was sitting on the curb of Belgrano Avenue. This is some 15 blocks away, and it was now 7:30 p.m. So apparently there's some missing time there. Fermin was disoriented and in a state of shock. He was taken to the hospital by his family, suffering from a nervous breakdown. He stayed there overnight. Later, there were some strange scratches found on the hood of his car, though it's not clear where those came from. But there were some corroborating witnesses, apparently. A family who insisted upon anonymity said that they were traveling on the same road in the opposite direction at the same time, and they saw a powerful beam of light coming down from above right near the railroad tracks. This is the exact location of the incident. They thought it was a train at first, but they changed their mind when this light shot off into the sky at high speed. Now when Fermin appeared on Belgrano Avenue, nobody saw this happen. Reportedly, a livestock truck parked on a steep street in the area moved by itself as if drawn by an unknown force, actually moving up the slope against the force of gravity where it crashed into the wall of a house. Later this same evening, around 9:30 p.m., a witness in the south section of the city said he saw strange, quote, sparks falling from the sky. He stopped his vehicle, and this is when he felt a strange sensation in his body. As he said, quote, I felt like my body was swelling, getting bigger, and I felt like I was going to burst. Another separate witness also said that they saw strange sparks coming down out of the sky. Finally, investigators did find burn marks in the grass in the area where Furman experienced this visitation. Following this initial contact, Furman says that he had, quote, strange dreams, which led him to believe that he was still in contact with these strange entities. Following the encounter, his health declined. It turned out he had a history of congenital kidney disease, which now manifested itself pretty severely. He started to require dialysis, and 2.5 years after this encounter, he died from the disease. Doctors say that, yeah, this was congenital, and there's no evidence that his encounter had anything to do with this. I really feel for the witness Fermin in this case. You can tell that this was a very difficult and scary encounter for him. And it's sad that he actually passed away not long after this encounter. And although the doctors say that he did have congenital kidney disease, it's clear that this encounter did not help him with that at all. So I don't know. It's a really unusual case. To me, the most unusual aspect of it is these humanoids. I've never heard humanoids described in quite that way. Though again, we see this incredible variety of ETs. Almost all humanoids, though, and having talked to a lot of contactees, apparently we do share a common heritage. And that is why we see the humanoid form, which appears to be the universal template. So there you go, another case involving humanoids. And now let's move to the next case, also really unusual. This one does appear to involve human-looking ETs, but they're not quite normal. I call this one beautiful green humanoids. This one occurred on August 5, 1980 in Sebolati, Uruguay. It's a single witness case with some really interesting physiological effects, but the whole interaction with the ETs is really unusual. This next case was published in the La Razón newspaper, and as far as I know has not been formally investigated. The witness is Julio Cesar Cabrera Pereira. He's a businessman from Sebolati, Uruguay. It was very early in the morning of August 5, 1980, when Julio heard a strange noise coming from outside his home. So he got out of bed, went to the front door and opened it, and he was immediately confronted by two tall humanoids, which were either wearing green skin-tight clothes or had green skin. As Julio says, they were very beautiful, and their body was wholly green. It was a tall person of slanted eyes and blonde hair. The whole body was a very luminous green, as if it were the color of the skin. By this being was another who had features like those of a woman, also blonde, with a sort of green turban and very impressive eyes. So Julio found himself now not only totally immobilized, but under the control of the strange figures. As Julio says, paralyzed, I only moved under the orders of a device they held in their hands, from which issued a luminous white ray that was directed at different parts of my body. The strange being hit my left hand with a small object resembling a pack of cigarettes, and I had the impression that it had cut off my fingers. On trying to re-enter the house, I had the sensation that an electric discharge was paralyzing me. I felt unable to walk, and one of those beings was by my side. The female being held a white slate of some kind, while the male figure seemed to use this weird black tool to, quote, hit me on the shoulder and make me turn around and on the knees to throw me to the ground. As Julio says, with the very small device he held, he dominated me. Without saying anything, he sat me down at a signal, threw me to the ground, or obliged me to move without my willing it. I was under the control of that object. So after several minutes of this, both beings promptly disappeared, and following the encounter, Julio suffered from an intense headache and pain in his legs. So we did go visit a doctor who revealed that he did find bruises on Julio's body. That encounter, to me, raises all kinds of questions. It's funny, people will often say, if ETs want to contact people, why don't they just come up to the front door and knock? Well, as you can see, these kinds of cases do happen. And yet, why did these ETs approach this man? What was that all about? Were they just studying him? I mean, these cases often raise more questions than they answer. And it's pretty clear that something did happen to this man, given that he had physiological effects which were confirmed by doctors. As far as I know, it wasn't formally investigated, so it's hard to say for sure, but absolutely an interesting account. Now let's move to the next one. I like this case. It's got multiple witnesses and some really unusual aspects to it. I call this one Come Into the Craft. This one occurred one evening in October of 1984 outside of Leningrad, Russia. Thanks to Albert Rosales for bringing this case to light, which was first published in Anomalous News newspaper in St. Petersburg, Russia, in a letter from the first-hand witness Olga Viktorovna Mikhailova, also published in Albert Rosales' book, Humanoids Among Us. One day in October 1984, Olga and some friends were returning to their homes near Leningrad, Russia, after working all day picking cabbages at a collective farm. On the way home, the tractor got stuck in the mud of a field, so they decided to set up camp right there. And it was after this, as evening was falling, that they saw a painfully brilliant light in the adjacent potato field. Now, as a group, the witnesses ran to the edge of this field and saw a 100-foot wide craft with multicolored lights sitting on landing legs. Some of the witnesses tried to approach the craft, but they said they were stopped by some kind of invisible force field. Olga, of course, was one of the people who tried to approach the craft, and she was actually running towards it when she smashed headfirst into this force field, which she said felt like, quote, rubber. She and the others watched birds also being deflected by the force field, including a large goose, which crashed so hard into the force field that it fell to the ground. At some point, Olga said she became disoriented. She really wasn't sure how long this encounter lasted, but suddenly returning to her senses, she saw that the craft had disappeared. And this is when she got an incredible shock. Of all the people there, only one other person in the group remembered seeing the UFO. Everyone else had no memory of it. Afterwards, Olga went to examine the ground where the craft had sat, and she did see a hexagonal depression burned into the soil, and at the corners of the hexagon there were deep holes in the ground, apparently from the landing legs. Olga wanted to talk about the encounter, but she remained silent for fear of being labeled crazy. And that seemed to be the end of the story. But 13 years later, out of the blue, Olga spontaneously remembered further details. She now remembered that while she and the others stood at the perimeter of the strange force field, a door-like opening appeared in the craft and a humanoid figure stood in the opening. The figure was tall, slender, with pale skin, white blonde shoulder-length hair, large dark eyes, and thin lips. It appeared to be male, and its face was devoid of expression. At this point, Olga heard a telepathic voice, soft and monotone, apparently coming from the ET, inviting her into the craft. As it did so, it stretched out its hand and pointed towards the open doorway. Now, apparently, at this point the protective force field turned off and Olga was able to approach. She recalled walking up to the doorway and looking inside the craft. She could now see a long corridor lit by a brilliant white light with unusual doorways on both sides of the corridor. She also looked at the floor and saw that it was glowing, and it appeared to have a strange, soft, sort of spongy, porous texture. Once again, the ET beckoned her to come inside, but Olga was frightened, and she resisted, and then she began to cry. The ET moved his palm in front of her face. Olga could now see that this being had unnaturally long, thin, white fingers with no fingernails. But at this point, she blacked out, and that is all she remembers. A very interesting case with all kinds of interesting details. To me, one of the really intriguing aspects of that particular case is this force field that was surrounding the craft. We hear that in a number of cases. Just goes to show how truly advanced the ETs are that they can do this. Also interesting is that this was a multiple witness case and nobody really even remembered it. Even the witness herself forgot most of the encounter. This amnesia aspect keeps turning up in case after case, and I certainly wonder about it. Makes me really wonder how many people have had an encounter like this and have no memory at all. Probably a lot. Another interesting aspect to this case is, although it appears to be wholly benevolent, the witness was quite frightened. I certainly can't fault her. This has got to be very scary. She declined the invitation. You have to wonder how you yourself would react given this kind of opportunity. Very hard to say until it happens to you. So now let's move to the next case. This is the final case in this compilation, and it's different for sure. This appears to be a case of ETs living and walking among us. This is a very recent case, which is quite rare. I call this one, I Am No Harm to You. This occurred on July 18, 2025, near Three Forks, South Dakota, in a wilderness area, to a very credible witness. It's quite an unusual encounter. The witness in this case is anonymous, so I'll just call him Timothy. And in his first-hand report to MUFON, he shares his background. As he says, I was a park ranger with the National Park Service at Badlands National Park and Minuteman Missile Natural Historic Site in South Dakota. I am an expert in ICBMs and gave tours of Delta 1 Underground Launch Control Facility and Delta 9. I maintain a top-secret SCI clearance. I also gave tours of these facilities in which I went through the launch procedure and basically the end-of-the-world scenarios to former missilers and even current generals, admirals, and intelligence officers. He says that his work in this area sparked his interest regarding UFO activity in these areas and in general, so he's a pretty good witness. It was around 2 p.m. on July 18, 2025. Timothy was hiking alone along the popular Spring Creek Flume Trail. This is located in the Black Hills near Three Forks, South Dakota. It's a beautiful area, and as he's walking along a straight, smooth section of the trail, he noticed a man ahead of him. It was of course not unusual to see occasional hikers, so he didn't pay too much attention. But as he got closer, he started to notice a number of strange details about this figure. And I'll just quote Timothy directly. As Timothy says, I could see he was about 20 years old. He was wearing black shoes and black shorts, no other clothing. He was about 6 feet tall, muscular, tan, and had extremely blonde curly hair. However, he had no backpack, fishing tackle, or water bottle, or anything whatsoever, which did strike me as odd. As I walked towards him for several minutes, he never turned to look at me until I got about 30 feet from him. It's as if he didn't hear me coming until the last second. When he finally turned to look at me, we locked eyes, and what I saw was most unexpected. The first thing I noticed was that he had bright blue eyes unlike any eyes I had ever seen. They were twice the size of mine and disproportionate to his head. The next thing I noticed was that his facial features were also disproportionate to his head. He had large eyes, unusually high cheekbones, and a narrow jawline. His ears were large and seemed to be glued to the side of his head. He looked extremely androgynous. He looked beautiful and ugly at the same time. But what really confused me was that his face was blurry. It's difficult to explain, but I couldn't actually focus on his face or facial features. I only got an impression of what I was seeing and his facial features. So Timothy and the man locked gazes, he estimates, for about 10 seconds. When Timothy thought to himself, Holy bleep, he's not human. So Timothy felt that the man was annoyed, then bewildered, and then he seemed to widen his eyes and step back as if frightened. Timothy had passed within 2 feet of the man, and this is when he got a sense that the man was embarrassed, which made Timothy himself feel a strange feeling of embarrassment. And then came the clincher for Timothy. As Timothy says, "As I passed him, I heard very distinctly in my head, and I quote, 'Keep walking. I am no harm to you.' So I did just that. I kept walking with my head down and my eyes glued to the ground. I never turned around to look at him again. I was too scared or embarrassed or felt awkward to ever look at him again." Later that day, unable to get the encounter out of his mind, he decided to hike back to this area. It was around 10 p.m., so he carried a very bright flashlight with some 40,000 lumens, and reaching the area where he had seen this strange man, he shone his flashlight off to the side of the trail, and about 25 feet away from him he saw, quote, 2 bright blue eyes staring back at me. He immediately put his flashlight back on the trail and kept walking. And as Timothy says, "As I did so, I heard the same voice in my head as before. 'Keep walking. I am no harm to you.'" So later, after thinking deeply about his encounter, Timothy is now convinced that he saw an extraterrestrial. As Timothy says, "I have no other option than to believe that he was an ET, or a hybrid, or something paranormal. He just didn't belong there, and the telepathic exchange was the final nail in the coffin for me. I'm confident I met a person from another planet that day and later that night. He simply wasn't human. I don't know what else to say. What I don't understand is why I couldn't see his specific facial features. Yet I got the impression that they were all wrong and blurry. I just don't understand it." I like that case because although it hasn't been investigated, this witness's background is quite impressive. I mean, he seems to be a very credible witness. And I do know of other cases of ETs living among us, so that's perhaps what's going on here. When I see these kinds of cases, I see a pattern when people describe ETs living among us. There are 3 things, 3 sort of details I look for. One is, are these ETs dressed strangely? Well, that's kind of true in this case. Do they have a strange appearance that's somehow unusual or different from humans? Absolutely true in this case. And do they behave in any unusual way? And we see that as well in this case. Not to mention, of course, the whole telepathic aspect, which was the real clincher for the witness. But what really made me think that this case is genuine was his description of being unable to focus on the figure's face. It would always become blurry. This turns up in a number of cases. In fact, I had that experience myself when I had an encounter. I simply could not focus on the being's face, which became really blurry. So to me, that is a real interesting sort of red flag that this case is probably genuine. And yeah, very recent. So there you go, 10 cases coming from all over the world of strange humanoids. And there's that theme of fear turning up again and again. Some of these cases are a little disconcerting, and fear does seem justified, but in a number of them perhaps not. I think fear is one of the things that makes it very difficult to study this subject, very difficult for people to perceive their experiences clearly, because we're not good observers when we're in a panicky fear state. At any rate, certainly interesting, and again, each case teaches us something not only about life beyond Earth, but about ourselves. So I hope you've enjoyed this episode. Thank you very much for watching. I truly appreciate it. And until next time, keep asking those hard questions. Keep searching for the truth. Most important of all, keep having fun. And I hope to see you next time for a new episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. Bye for now. Be good.